This is Maccabees 1, 2, and 3, and I didn't really get very far in 4, but it's not as exciting anyway. So we'll get the gist of it. So I was sharing with the session earlier. I've been listening to a podcast from a Catholic theologian just on the history of this, and I'm in no way going to do justice to it. One, I'm not a historian. I don't remember historical facts. I'm not very good with dates. But I do consider myself someone who can understand the movement of things. And honestly, I remember the podcast started out actually in a really interesting way. He was a Catholic theologian, and he said one of the biggest critiques that people have about books like Maccabees and Judith and Sirach and all these other things we're studying is they often say, oh, the Catholics added them in and the Protestants took them out. And he made a point to say neither are true. And I think it was a really helpful distinction for me, just as a general rule, that when you think about the fact of the development of literature around the time of Christ, you had the translation of the Hebrew Bible into the Septuagint in the last part of the couple, I don't remember what exact date it is, before Christ was around on the scene. And so you had this Greek Old Testament, or all the holy books of the Old Testament were translated into Greek, not for any other reason than, again, the influence of the Greeks moving west had such an impact that more and more people became Greek speakers and Greek readers. So things eventually transitioned into the Greek language. So in the beginning of the early church, all of our New Testament books are written in Greek. Some of these intertestamental books are written in Greek. So when the early church began, and I've said this before in a church history lesson, that if you want to take the line of really from the time of prior to, I would say, maybe the 5th century, right, prior to the time of Constantine, there was no uniform way of thinking. There was no doctrine of the Trinity. There was no standardized way to baptize. There were all these sort of, and it was small. People were like, oh, it's small house churches. I hear that again. Oh, we're returning to an early church model to small house churches and doing this like the biblical way. Well, part of that was just necessity. They didn't have big buildings. It was a new branch of Judaism. They couldn't use the synagogues because it wasn't accepted there. Well, they didn't have the fund. It was, no one really had a lot of money back then. So they couldn't build new structures right off the bat. So they met in home. It was like a default thing. The other thing I like to remind people who tout that their, early church or New Testament model is they're not really. They're just meeting in homes. They're small churches meeting in homes. The New Testament model really would have been like, okay, everyone dump your money into a pot, and we're all going to make sure everyone has some sense of equity because we see the end times coming and we want to live in a way that we're called to. I mean, in the New Testament and the new kingdom and the new heaven and the earth, it's and you have nothing, that won't be an ethic that's there. We'll all have some sense of equity or some sense of provision for all. So, New Testament churches that say they're living like that, but they all live in their own home, they all have their own calls, they all have their own things. The only thing they're doing is meeting in churches. So but all that's to say is they developed their doctrines as the Orthodox Church, and that lasted to about 1000 AD. And that's when the Roman Catholic Church, or the Western Church, that had developed from about the time of 500. So as Constantine out of Rome sanctioned sort of the Western Christian expression, and then when the fall of Rome happened, Benedict and by himself, and eventually his compadres, established a community in the Cassio outside of Rome. And for then the dark period of the early Middle Ages, when Christianity was not even seen and much less talked about, as that reemerged in the 7th and 8th century, really around the beginning of the 8th century, you have this missionary movement that from Gregory the Great that basically solidified Benedictine spirituality for all. So, but all that's to say is the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church that dominated the scene until the 1500s, until the Reformation, largely, and even though we've looked at all these books and we've said they believe they're canonical or deuterocanonical, they do so because they base their canon and the inspiration of Scripture off of the Septuagint. the Greek translation that happened in the last few centuries before Christ. So when your default is coming into the new scene, well, these are the Greek writings we have. This is the entire Old Testament. Again, I like to remind people that when any time in the New Testament it mentions scriptures, it's not self-referential. It's always the scriptures, meaning the Old Testament scriptures or the canon that comes out of that. It wasn't until the second, probably 175 up to the 5th century, where we have the canonization of our New Testament books. And even that had a criteria, usually apostolic succession. Can we trace it back to an apostle? But that said, Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church primarily draw their canonicity for the scriptures from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and the continuation of that through the Greek New Testament. Makes sense, right? This is what we have. Why would you question that? Now, the Jews, on the other hand, during this period, and particularly the intertestamental period, where a lot of these documents were being written in Greek, said these are history books. And that's not to say that they don't contribute to our understanding of history, but they are not the books given by God. So the Jews rejected much of those intertestamental books, or the books that we call the apocryphal books. So in the time of the Protestant Reformation coming around in the 15th century, Luther, primarily led by him, and Luther and his forces, said, decision to make now that the Bible is becoming sola scriptura, our authority, not the church, not the hierarchy of the church. It wasn't a rejection of the hierarchy. It was a suspicion of the hierarchy. Why? Because there were abuses. I mean, if you're looking at a church that's charging indulgences and showing corruption, you're going to say, well, I don't really want to be a part of this. Something's wrong. And they recognized that when the corruption of the church had come from leadership, not from necessarily the scriptures. And then they say, well, sola scriptura. Well, what are the scriptures? We have to define what the scriptures are. So for the New Testament books, they use the same criteria, the apostolic succession. This is why largely Roman Catholic and Orthodox New Testament books are very similar to ours. But when they look back and they said, we have these Old Testament books that are accepted by the Jews, and then we have these intertestamental books that are accepted by the Roman Catholic Church, and many of the doctrines that they found abusive came from those intertestamental books. And they're like, hey, if the Jews don't accept them, why should we? So a decision was made not to reject those or to take them out, but to say our criteria for understanding what the Old Testament is aligning ourselves with the Jews from which we carry our theological lineage. All right. Does that make sense? Yeah. Does that feel comfortable?
So far.
Okay. But saying that, so when I dug into this whole idea of, or started digging around the Maccabees, this is, I've heard of the Maccabean revolt. They talk about it at seminary. It's kind of a passing comment. But what we have essentially in 1 and 2, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, we have this concept of what was happening really between the years of, I don't even, where would I put those three? I mean, somewhere between the 200 and really almost bleeding into the time of Christ. So this is both 1st and 2nd Maccabees, just from a larger view, deal with the historicity of a major revolt that happened on the tail end of Alexander the Great's leadership. So, and we'll talk about this in a second. I'll give you the larger overview. So what you have is the 1st Maccabees deals with this larger section of the succession of 4 revolts, starting with Matthias, or I say Matthias, that's a character from a book that Silas and I read. Mattathias and his 3 sons that succeeded him, Judas of Maccabee, Jonathan, and Simeon, and then his son John of Hyrcanus. The Maccabees 1 highlights their societal conflicts and conquests. Maccabees 2 focuses really on more detail that comes out of 1st Maccabees in the chapters 1 through 6, and gives a background rationale for why this revolt eventually happened. So it gives some background information. Maccabees 3 functions actually as as what sort of a background of what happened before the revolts ever happened. It's meant to be sort of a historic account. And the Maccabees 4 largely considered to be legendary stories that surround and a compilation of legendary stories, peppers in details, but the Orthodox Church does consider that as a part of the canon, but the Roman Catholic Church has rejected Maccabees, fourth Maccabees or Maccabees 4, because of its the nature of its writings seems a little bit off. The stories seem fantasaical, and so although it contains and it's very emotional in its nature, it's almost like the stories that were written about these things. To again, probably if you want to look at it from that 50,000 foot perspective, these are all books that are written to Jews to help solidify their expression of Judaism. So Maccabees 1, a larger picture of what happened during, I was going to find the dates, probably 175, if you will, all the way up to maybe 40 AD or BC. And then Maccabees 2 is a more detailed version of that. Maccabees 3 is a precursor or prologue to what was happening prior to these revolts. Maccabees 4 is legendary accounts that highlight, and we probably won't even get to Maccabees 4 because they didn't really do much study around it other than that. So a little bit of background. You remember, it was interesting too. I heard the larger, when you look at it, the larger enslavement, if you want to track sort of Israel's imprisonment or subjugation through different nations, you had Egypt leading up to the time. Israelites were just Israelites. And then you have Joseph, and they came to Egypt, and then there was too many of them, and they were enslaved by the Egyptians for 400 and some years. They broke free. They went up. All the wilderness stuff. They took over Canaan, became the Promised Land. They grew into the Davidic Empire, or the Davidic Kingdom. It was separated. It was passed on to Solomon. Solomon's sons, again, Jeroboam and Rehoboam, split the kingdom into two. And then you have about a 200-year period where you have evil kings in the north and some good ones, but mostly evil kings also in the south. And then you have the Babylonians, who basically overtook northern Israel, or what we know as Israel, and the southern kingdom was eventually taken over by the Babylonians. And they went into Babylonian exile for 70 years. Well, then the Persians come in and they conquer the Babylonians and the whole Syrian region of that area. And the Persians then reestablish Judaism, and they send them back. This is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. They establish the kingdom. They rebuild the temple. They consecrate the temple. You have this development of people, again, of the Israelites coming around. And the Persians, in large part, allowed Jews to exist on their own. There was still some sense of influence and governance, but in large part, the Persian king was not interested in domination. Well, as we learned, I don't know, was it last week or 2 weeks ago? I don't remember. The grandson of Cyrus didn't feel the same way and began to start to subjugate the Jews in a little bit more way, and there's challenges. But in the midst of that, post the Babylonian exile, about 200 years, so you had about 200 years of Persian rule from the time they returned. So a period of 200 years where the Jews were reestablished, defining themselves as a people. And then you have, after this Persian rule, you have the Greeks moving west. And this is the period of Alexander the Great. And apparently, there was a poll done about who was the greatest sort of military conquistador in all of history. And Alexander the Great is looked at as this pivotal figure. He just sort of stands. But the interesting thing that I didn't know about Alexander the Great was he carried on. He actually reestablished that reign of tolerance that allowed the Jews to exist in the way they were. So although he conquered all the way down to Egypt, all the way up through Turkey, all the way across and almost to India, he was stopped in India. And the commentator I read said it's because they ran out of steam, but I'm not certain about this. So I'm sort of going out a little bit on a limb, but when Judah's classmate came back who's from Nepal, came back at Thanksgiving, I don't even remember the names of them, but he kept talking about these Nepali warriors that I think were he said that he basically they prevented the Greeks from expanding into India. And because they basically hit the region of Nepal, and the fervency of these warriors, and this is like a great part of the folklore, the history of Nepal, that these warriors were ultimately the last stand that prevented the Greeks from going too far east into India. Mm-hmm. So when you look at this giant conquered land, you have all the way from northern Africa up to India, up to probably the southern part of the southern eastern part of the European region of the world. But that's a massive expanse, and Alexander would have conquered the world. His goal was that everyone should speak Greek. It's kind of like that big fat Greek wedding. The Greeks thought that they should be the dominant culture in all of the world. But he didn't do it with a sense of domination. He did it in a sense of overtaking in governance and tolerance, and allowing the different people groups to exist and live as they were. Well, Alexander died in 323, and before he died, he pulled together his leaders, and he didn't pass it on to his son, but he passed it on to two generals, and they basically divided the Alexandrian Empire into the region of Syria, which was sort of the biblical region we're dealing with, and Egypt. So Judea was controlled by someone. Egypt was controlled by someone named, I don't know how to say this, Polemics, who was a leader who somewhat allowed carried on that tradition of tolerance. But the Seleucids were put in Syria, and they were the second general ruling that region, and he was less tolerant of that. And so the Polemics ruled from 300-ish to the 200 until the Seleucids began to take control. And what you have in this region, if you want to think, I'm doing it from my perspective, you have Egypt down here, and the Mediterranean, and then Syria, and you have right in the middle of that, you have what we now know as Israel. So it was a hinge point between these two competing empires. And it was during the Seleucid reign of Judea that the Maccabean revolt happened. And it was because of the evil nature, sort of even going back to Jezebel and Ahab at the time of some of the more evil kings of the eighth century. That you have this sort of desecration happening. And at the same time, I'll say too, as the Greeks, because they divided their kingdom, were divided themselves. This is actually an interesting analogy as I think about it. When they divided the Israel into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they lost power. Well, the great Alexandrian Empire, when divided to east and the west, between the Polemics and the Seleucids, they lost power. And at that time, then in that region of Syria, you have the Roman influence starting to take over. And then by the time of Christ, you have that, although Greece was still that major Hellenization, that influence was still there. That's why they call it Greco-Roman, because you had the Roman influence coming up and it became a Greco-Roman culture. And this is eventually, you had stuff in Greek all the way to the far eastern side of Constantinople, which was the headquarters or the main city of Eastern Orthodoxy. And in the West, you had Rome, which is the major Western capital of Christianity. And eventually the language was not written in Greek, but in Latin, which was the dominant language at the time of the Western Empire. So if you will, you have this sort of tension and this moment in the last 100 to 150 years before Christ, where the Seleucid Empire and the Roman Empire, so you had conflict between Romans and Greeks influencing, but the Seleucids were very much against the Jews. They didn't like them. In this account, what we have in Maccabees is the evidence or the history of what happened during that time, if you will. And you have the Maccabees 1, or if anyone's looking, the Roman influence is highlighted in Maccabees, First Maccabees 8. 1 through 17. I'll just read a few verses. A eulogy to the Romans. Now Judas heard of the fame of the Romans, that they were all strong and well disposed towards all who made alliances with them, that they pledged friendships to those who came with them, and that they were strong, and even told of their wars and their brave deeds they were doing among the Gauls, those are the early French, how they had defeated them and forced them to pay tribute, and what they had done in the land of Spain to get all the silver and gold mines. And so what you're seeing is that influence of Rome coming in, which eventually, ultimately, what came out of the time of biblical times, where the Romans were in control and ruled, and brought about the Roman influence of not only of Paul's imprisonment, but of Christ's crucifixion, and the Romans giving Christ over to the Jews at the time. So, but in that regard, and I want to look at, I think the best way to do is actually to look at the first chapter. I think it tells a lot of the story, but just a couple points about the book of First Maccabees. One, it's really looked at as a justification of what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. And I don't know why it's called, I didn't look up in the details of why the Hasmonean language comes out of it, but the Hasmonean dynasty is really meant to capture the succession of the four sons of Mattathias, who was a Jewish priest, and he had 5 sons, and 3 of them, so Judas again followed Mattathias, followed by Jonathan, followed by Simeon, and then Simeon's son, John of Hyrcanus, was the one who picked up the charge after that. But what was happening is, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail, and I'll show you some of it in the text, is that as this revolt happened because of the desecration of the temple, because of the persecution and the subjugation of the Jews, and they got to the point where they said, no, this is not going to happen. And Maccabees, really all of them are centered around this revolt of Jews saying, one, we are being too Hellenized. We're becoming too Greek. We're reading Greek. We're writing in Greek. We're picking up Greek cultures. We're worshiping Greek gods. There's a watering down identity. And no, we need to reclaim this. And I think this is great. This is what, battled military stories. And so that starts with the revolt. And Maccabees 1 chronicles the military campaigns to both reclaim identity of the Jews, but to also reclaim Jerusalem and its temple, the reestablishment of the temple, and to then extend the Jewish boundaries again, so that there was, by the time the Romans had come on, an established land of sort of Israel, if you will. This is Maccabees 1 is the only book of the 4 Maccabees that was considered to have been originally likely written in Hebrew. And the rest were written in Greek of some form. And largely that's taken from, you can just tell when certain Hebrew phrases are transliterated into Greek, but the other ones are thought to have written in a Greek syntax. And I believe that's what it was. I may have to check that one of them might have also had Greek or Hebrew influences. The dating of it really goes back, but I should say that today, though, we only have copies of Greek in any of it. The only versions we have of this come from the Septuagint. So it's not even, and not that there haven't been other discoveries that have confirmed these as being Greek documents, but that our modern day resources, manuscripts, all go back to the Greek versions. None of them go back to the Hebrew versions, although they thought that it was written in Hebrew. The dating of this really goes back to maybe 100, and it was as being at the end of the revolt as a retelling and a recapturing, because no one's concerned with writing history perhaps in the middle of it, but in the end of the reflection, and really probably ended around 104, which was the death of John Hyrcanus, the son of Simeon, one of the sons of Mattathias. One of the major uses that come out of this is this alongside, and we talked about that with Judith when she went and killed the king and chopped off his head. That was set within the boundaries of these battles, but the Jewish source for Hanukkah. And in fact, if you look at Maccabees 4, Maccabees 4:36, cleansing and the dedication of the temple. And this was the justification of why the Jews, even though it's not considered a canonical book, which is interesting, they have 3 major holidays: Passover, which obviously comes from the Passover texts in the Exodus. You have Purim, which is drawn from the deliverance of the Jews found in Esther. And then you have Hanukkah, the 8 days of light, or the 8 days of celebration, and that comes actually largely from the book of Maccabees. So if you in my Bible at the top of 436, the subtitle is the cleansing and the dedication of the temple. And it starts off, then Judah said to his brothers, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So they basically went on, and the story goes on, and they tell how they actually rededicated the temple. And then it says on 56, so they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days, 8 days of Hanukkah, and joyfully offered burnt offerings, that's the candles, and they offered a sacrifice of well-being and a Thanksgiving offering. So this is why Hanukkah is filled with joy and celebration and light, and you have these 8 days of lighting the temple. And don't forget that Judith highlighted that miracle, that idea that when they went to light, they didn't have enough. They went to light the light, the flames in the temple, but they didn't have enough oil, and it was this miracle of enough oil lasting to keep the temple burning for 8 days, or the lights burning for 8 days, despite the fact that there wasn't enough oil, and this was looked at as God's provision. And then down to 59, the Judas and the brothers and assembled the Israel. And all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. Now, it's not surprising that the 25th day of Chislev is December 25th. So what's interesting for me as a somewhat Christmas historian, if you will, if there's anything I studied historically, Christmas is that one of those areas that this was an already established a festival of lights around Christmas time. Also, strangely enough, being a time of solstice, when pagans and druids would celebrate the darkest night of the year and the beginning turning back to light. So when Constantine came around in the 4th century, after he Christianized the Roman Empire, to the Holy Roman Empire, and felt like there was too much partying going on around this season, probably both from the Jews and the Gentiles, or from the pagans, basically established Christianity during this time. And that beginning of Christianity, Christmas is a 12-day celebration that begins on December 25th, not a one-day celebration. So this, the purpose of this book, or the main theological weight of this book, actually comes for the Jews in the form of the establishment of Hanukkah. I wouldn't say beyond that, that's sort of where they use it. I already talked about the canonicity. Again, Jews don't view it. Protestants view it as the Apocrypha, good for edification, good for teaching, just not inspired. And Roman Catholic and Orthodox, because of their reliance on the Septuagint, do look at it as inspired and name it as deuterocanonical. The structure of it in general, and I'll read a few parts of this, but just as a sort of overview, 1 through 9 introduces Alexander the Great, which I just thought was fantastic. I was like, what? Alexander the Great made it into the Bible. Good on him. I didn't even know that until, in at least someone's Bible. It's considered and then the next part of that, from 1:9 to 1:15, covers about a 40-year period from the Seleucid king Antiochus of Epiphanes, who died in 175, to all the way to the period of 143. So in other words, this book is thought to have been covering a period from 175 BC to 134 BC, despite the fact that it was thought to have been written in 100. So again, 30 years after the end of it, they're reflecting upon it, saying this is what happened, and let's put this into the annals of our history. 116 through 64 goes back and describes Antiochus's persecution of the Jews, which included the desecration of the temple, the construction of a citadel with garrisons near the temple in order to suppress the Jewish worship, so no Jews could even approach the temple, and the general suppression of the Jews. 1 through 70, so most of the chapter 2, or all of chapter 2, it introduces the character of the Jewish priest Mattathias and his initial, and we'll look at that in a second, his initial leading into the rebellion. And then you have 3 periods after that that highlight 3 of the 5 sons and the revolts and the military campaigns that they led the Jews through. 3:1 through 9:22 is Judas of Maccabees. And then it was passed on from 9:23 to 12:53, or the end of 12, by Jonathan of Maccabees. And then 13:1 to 16 to the end of the book, followed by Simeon or Simon, and closes in the last few verses, acknowledging the head tilt towards his son, John Hyrcanus. So let's just dive into it and look at that. And I'll just read a few portions to kind of orient you. I think, and again, this is stuff that we don't talk about, but the entire military identity of the Jews, the entire taking back over, reclaiming land, reclaiming identity. This is the narrative that's seeded less than, or about 100, was still in, if they're writing it in 100, and Christ was thought to be born in 104, or at the latest they did it in 104 writing it, and Christ was thought to maybe have been birthed in 4. That's 100 years prior to Christ's birth. This militaristic revolt coming from the Jews to reclaim who they were and to fight Hellenization and to sets the stage for Jesus on the scene. So when you think about that, still in the psyche of the Jews, thinking like we are reestablishing, and yet there was Roman occupation. Yeah, Glenda.
Couple questions. Just one little aside. Was the disciple Judas a descendant of this Judas Maccabeus?
That I do not know. That's a good question. Just because his name was Judas, I wouldn't presume that. Presumably it was a pretty popular name until the whole Judas incident.
Because he was looking for a more political Messiah, and given that all that history.
Yeah, I mean, Simon.
And I got lost in all the names of all the different battles and leaders and foreign leaders that were trying to take over. But one thing that I came away from this, it hardly mentions God. It seems like what they're fighting for is for a nationalistic identity as Jews. Then, I mean, sure, the temple was the symbol of that, but I don't know that it hardly even mentions God through this entire book. And it didn't seem like it was a religion as much as it was a political campaign.
I would say yes, that is true, but I would also add that I think that there was a issue or concern of Jewish identity, and returning to a Jewish understanding of who they were as a people and reestablishing. Again, Jews are still operating on the basis of the Abrahamic covenant. We have a land that belongs to us. You've given us a people, and you've given us a forefounding father of the name of Abraham. And so there was still a sense of their identity as a people were being squelched or dispersed. And, from the time of the Babylonian invasion and the exile for 70 years, and even the reestablishment, the Jews they went to Persia. The northern kingdoms being influenced by the Babylonians, and then they exiled. And then when the Persians came over and they were still in exile, then there's a Persian influence. And this is the whole situation in Esther. And then they go return, and they're always trying to return to that identity. And this is another case where now, as the Greeks are coming over and they saw the Hellenization happen, and the Romans are starting to invade, and this Greco-Roman culture is influenced, they're saying, hey, we need to define ourselves as individuals. I mean, you think about the fact that even those first Jews, most of the Bible, or I guess not really most of the New Testament, all of the New Testament was written by Jews, but it's not written in Hebrew. It's written in Greek. So there's a battle to say we are losing our identity to the invasion of other occupying nations, and we need to return and hold on to that identity, which honestly just makes the whole entry of Christ on the scene and saying this isn't about, and actually they think that Mattathias was probably a part of the Pharisaical religion or sect of Christianity or Judaism, because he believed in the resurrection of the body. And that was the big difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, is the Pharisees believed in the resurrection, the Sadducees did not. Because the Sadducees were more influenced by Greek mythology that said sort of this Gnostic dualism of when you're, the evil of the world and the liberation of the spirit. And so that when the body dies, the body's done. The Sadducees weren't saying that the existence of the soul wasn't there. They were saying that that we're almost entrapped in this punishment on this earth in these physical bodies.
Jason,
Yeah.
Jason, you think Barabbas was part of the Maccabees?
Who?
Barabbas?
Oh, Barabbas. You mean the thief?
Well, I thought it also he was more of revolt too. Did he do? I thought he was.
Yeah, I mean Simon the Zealot, not Simon Peter, and Judas Iscariot were. I mean, without looking, Glenda, I would say it's likely that they are coming out of the same vein of thought. Whether the Maccabees as a Hasmonean dynasty was still existing at the time of Christ, I can't say. I didn't get that far into the literature, but it seeds our understanding of why Christ, even as we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount now, Christ is like, everything you think about the way the Judaism works is not going to happen. It's not right. It's you're missing the whole point. What's that?
Isn't that the message that John the Baptist brought? That he was telling them, you think because you're children of Abraham that you're saved, just because of your Jewish heritage. And he was preparing the idea that it wasn't about just their Jewish identity. That was
exactly. Yeah, I mean, and in that regard, he blew the door open and said that even though you're reestablishing these Jewish identities, you're establishing around these military forces and the idea that we're going to overtake. But again, I don't blame them for that. I mean, look what happened when the Davidic conquest happened. David was, kicking tail all over the place and killing people left and right. And same with Solomon. And so until the kings went evil, things were going pretty well for Israel. And they weren't by like negotiating, with savvy words. It was by, we're going to go conquer a land. I mean, even Canaan at the original thing, they conquered a land. It was always by violence. So I don't blame the Jews for having this concept of by violence, we're going to overtake. In particular, when only 150 years before that, they reclaimed Jerusalem and the temple and in the name of Yahweh, and we're honored for that to some extent. Jim, were you going to ask something? Say something? Okay. So look at Maccabees 1, and we'll do this quickly because I realize we're chit-chatting a lot, and that's okay because this is interesting stuff. But Alexander the Great, the first 1 through 9, the son of Philip, blah, blah, blah. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, he put to death the kings of the earth, he advanced to the ends of the earth, according to what they thought at the ends of the earth at the time, and plundered many nations. And where the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. He gathered the very strong armies and ruled over countries, nations, princes, and they became tributaries to him. Again, signifying the difference between oppression and collaboration or tolerance. After he fell sick, verse 5, after he fell sick and perceived he was dying, he summoned his most honorable officers who had brought him up with him from youth and divided his kingdom among them while he was still alive. And after Alexander had reigned for 12 years, he died. His officers began to rule, each in his own place, and they all put crowns after his death. And so did their descendants. And for many years, they caused many evils and death. And then you have in 10, you have the entrance of Antiochus Epiphanes and the renegade Jews. From them came forth a sinful root. Antiochus Epiphanes, a son of Antiochus, he had become a hostage in Rome. He began to reign 137 years, and there's the dating of the kingdom of the Greeks. And so an indication of the Greeks had already taken over those times. In those days, renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for we separate from them. Many disasters have come. For since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinance of the Gentiles. So they're saying the problem was they were acquiescing to the Gentile or to the Greek ways of living. So they built a gymnasium, and that's not like a gym with some basketball hoops. That was a Greek structure in Jerusalem, according to the Gentile custom, and removed the marks and remove the marks of circumcision. There was a whole discussion about this in one of the commentaries, that they basically were trying to remove that Jewish distinction, and that's big.
Whoa.
That's, I mean, I don't know what they were doing. That's some good duct tape, but
Gee.
they abandoned the Holy Covenant, sign of the Abrahamic covenant. The very foundation of everything that Israel is based upon was circumcision of the males. And so when they're trying to reverse that, and then they joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to evil. Antiochus saw that his kingdom was established. He determined to become a king of the land of Egypt in order that he might reign over both kingdoms. So he invaded Egypt with a strong force and chariots and elephants and cavalry with a large fleet. He engaged King Ptolemy of Egypt and battled. They fled before him, and many were wounded and fell. They captured the cities. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned the 154th third year, again dating it for us, and went up against Israel. So now Israel becomes that stronghold between Egypt and Syria, where the forces need to come down, and came to Jerusalem with strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar and the lampstand for the light and all the utensils. And he also took the table for the bread of the presence and the cups for drinking offering and the bowls and the golden censers and the curtain and the crowns and the golden decorations in front of the temple. And he stripped it all off. He took the silver and gold and the costly vessels. He took the hidden treasures he found, and taking them all into his own land, he shed much blood, spoke with arrogance. Israel mourned deeply, and the community, rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of the women faded. Every bridegroom took up the lament. She who sat in the bridal chambers were mourning, and even the land had trembled for its inhabitants. All of the house of Jacob was clothed in shame. And then you have, and I'm not going to read all of it, but it goes on to the beginning of the occupation of Israel. And they talk about what they did. They took the livestock, they created a citadel, the installation of, and then in 141, the installation of Jewish cults. They defiled the sanctuary and the priest, built altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, and offered swine, unclean animals, and left and to leave their sons uncircumcised. And they went to make themselves abominable in any unclean and profane way, so that they could not forget the law and change the ordinances. And he added, and whoever does not obey the king shall die. So this is the first case of martyrdom among the Jewish people. Like, to be a Jew within the context of this meant you were risking your life. Chapter 2, you get Mattathias and his son. They refused to worship. They refused to eat pork. In verse 2:19b, even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of their ancestors. I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenants of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the laws and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. And then he and his sons, verse 28, fled to the hills and left all they had in town. And then verse 41, so they made the decision that day, let us fight against anyone who comes to attack us on the Sabbath day. And if you remember, this goes back to the whole story of Judith, when she tricked the general saying, hey, the Israelites don't attack on the Sabbath. They won't battle on the Sabbath because it's against their laws. So they said, you know what? Let's forget the Sabbath for this moment. And when they come to attack, we're going to fight back. Let us not all die as kindred died in their hiding places. And they start reestablishing the counterattack in verse 42. I did underline, and Matthias and his friends went around and tore down the altars. They forcibly circumcised all of the uncircumcised boys that they found on the borders of Israel. That sounds a little miserable to me. And then they go through the last words of Matthias, the history of Israel. And then it starts into the different conquests that go from 3:9 to 9:12 to 3:16. And it's just battle after battle and telling the story of it. But if you haven't read it, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of like, hey, this is a major revolt in Judaism that reestablished them as a people group. And here's the thing that I want to pose. Had this not happened, what would have been the result? Had the revolt not reclaimed Jewish identity, the result theoretically, hypothetically, could have been that you have the entire loss of a Jewish identity, or such a small point of shrinking them to a small few or a small faithful, or just to a small, massive, again, attempts not only in Purim and of Esther, and then again in the time of the Maccabees, and then again in the time of Hitler. There's a constant desecration and attempt to obliterate the Jews from the face of the earth, yet God still remains faithful and reestablishes them as a people. So, all right, that's Maccabees 1. Any thoughts, questions? Until we're going to quickly go over Maccabees 2 and 3, and I'll just read a paragraph from my Bible on Maccabees 4.
I can understand why it is in the canon, because all it is battle after battle after battle after battle. And it's, I just get like, why can't people figure out ways to live together peacefully? Why does it always have to be massive slaughter?
Well, the root of sin is self-preservation. And I would say, argue even on an individual level, Cain and Abel, self-preservation. You have an upper hand. You're going to be favored by the gods. I'm not. I'm going to kill you. The very first thing that happened in the Bible was an act of self-preservation. And then why do we have tribes and people groups that cluster together? Why? Because if we're a tribe, then my self-preservation is assured by you. And so we build, and it's a constant. So, any country who tries to take over the other is to let's propagate ourselves, because this expands our kingdom and provides longevity and self-preservation. And the battle of the revolt is a counter resistance for self-preservation. Now, this is the interesting thing about the gospel, is when Jesus comes on and says it's not the letter of the law, it's the spirit of the law. You're not flesh, you're spirit. All of a sudden, when we're freed from the boundaries, and it's kind of a Greek philosophy brought into Gnosticism, but the idea that this is a temporal space for us and that our true citizenship is in heaven, well, then all of a sudden it doesn't make a difference. So when Jesus says, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, be persecuted for my sake, because he's trying to communicate the idea that this whole concept of self-preservation is completely opposite of what we're calling you to. Jesus came to have self-sacrifice for the sake of the other, and we in our discipleship are called to do the same. It's not about my self-preservation, it's about the flourishing of the other. So it all boils down to this sort of, the basis of that. So every war and every battle that exists in the history of the world is about domination and power for self-preservation, for fear of annihilation, because the human condition is one that fears the non-existence of who we are, which is why it's always an existential crisis, as opposed to, the legitimacy of our land. It's not even about prosperity. In our common day world, it is. I mean, in the US, it's about protecting our way of life, but again, self-preservation. This is why, again, going back to the early church and New Testament churches, the very act of giving up everything you have for the sake of the kingdom and the sake of the community is, I'm not concerned about my self-preservation. I'm concerned about our bearing witness in the testimony of what we've been called to bear. All right. What time is it? In 5 minutes or 10 minutes, we'll do 10 minutes of the second Maccabees. It is not a continuation of the story. It is not a sequel, and a lot of people think it might be. It actually overlaps chapters 1 through 7. It really highlights the period of about 180 to 161 within that. And Maccabees runs all the way again to 137, 135. So 30 years prior to the end of Maccabees, usually those three other attacks, those three other revolts that we have in Maccabees, first Maccabees, are not covered. It provides more detail. It gives the background of the Hasmonean revolt, which is Maccabees 1. It kind of gives the information of what was building in that time. The storyline runs from a high priest named Ananias III, all the way through the defeat of General Nicanor by Judas of Maccabee, the first major revolt after Mattathias. It's dated as being written about 126. Again, that's about 40 years after the end of the period that they were covering. So again, it's always reflected back. I mean, this is true of the Bible. We think Mark was written probably in the 60s, 70s, Matthew following, and Luke following, and maybe in the 80s, 90s, and then John being written probably in the 90s to 110s. I don't really have the dates exactly. I'm sort of spitballing, but in general, they were read in succession. But again, with the first gospel written by Mark, or the earliest documents we have of Mark, was written 30 some years after Christ was on the scene. So there's periods of reflection, there's oral tradition carried on, passed on, eventually written down. Maccabees 2 was written in Greek. It was thought to have been written by a character by the name of Epitome, who was he was the one who was a Pharisee because of his doctrines of resurrection. And Second Maccabees actually gives us more doctrinal statements around the narrative of what happened. And much of the Roman Catholic Church's thought that we as Protestants may oppose or have difficulty with come from these chapters here. And I'll point those out in a second. So for canonicity, the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church both believe this is deuterocanonical. Jews reject it entirely, and the Protestants look at it as apocryphal, again, useful for teaching and edification, but not necessarily from God. These are considered to have a series of letters that have been written, five volume work by a guy named Jason of Cyrene that is noted in chapter 2, verse 23, and also another place. All of this, which has been set forth by Jason of Cyrene in 5 volumes, shall be attempted to condense into a single book. So there you have it. It's self-proclaimed. These are 5 different things, 5 different letters are written. They were smushed together to kind of chronicle this period and to talk about some of the Jewish theology that existed. And this is where I think is really interesting, because when we're talking about this, we're not talking about Gentile theology, we're talking about Jewish theology that then first century Orthodox and eventually Western Church Roman Catholic adapted as their own. So the question becomes are these things that should have been left in the Judaism prior to Christ's time, or are they things that are still valid today? There was an epilogue ad after the introduction. There's an epilogue ad that runs through 219 through 32. A prologue and an epilogue in 1537 to 39. Other than that, there are 2 views of how it actually folds out. One is more of a Hebraic view that says it has a Deuteronomic theme that follows the pattern of blessing, introduction of sin, God's punishment of the sin, the turning of the Jews, judgment and restoration and salvation. Other views take a more militaristic view of this and say that the first attack goes from 3, 1 through 40. The second attack goes from 4:1 to 10:8, and the third attack goes from 10:9 to 15:37. But what we do know is within these 5 letters, there were concrete themes that come out, and these is really why I want to spend more majority of the time, because again, it takes a part of the history of it. It gives some detail around those battles or those revolts or the reasons why those revolts happened and some of the background of how they got to the Maccabean revolts. But the theological themes, the first 4 are sort of focused on Judaism, and they're not going to be unfamiliar to you. God's defense of Jerusalem and the temple. So the recovery of Jerusalem, the recovery of the temple, God's faithfulness in that, God's protection of the Jewish people when they are loyal to him and to the covenant, then God restored. And there's sort of this looked at as this revolt was a return to honoring the covenant and the laws. Faithfulness unto death. There are strong themes of you may die in this. This is maybe the sacrifice you have to offer, but your faithfulness is critical. And I think that's interesting to me, in part because that region of the world, that in Japan maybe, or in some of the Asian countries, but there's you have to think of the idea of the challenges we've had in 9/11. The reason they flew a plane because there was a sense of martyrdom for a cause. So for the propagation of the community, one may have to sacrifice, which is right in the vein of Christianity. One sacrifices for all. This is not but this is a Middle Eastern or ancient Near Eastern ideal that comes out again in the Maccabean revolt. And the punishment of the impious, which is not surprising, and considering those who are unfaithful will be punished. the way they have influenced later Judaism and in particular Christianity, and this is, I think, worthwhile, the resurrection of the dead. And that's less controversial because we believe that, and there are other places in the scriptures that talk about the resurrection of the dead. But that comes out in chapter 7 and in chapter 14, 37 through 46, where there's mention of the resurrection of the dead. And I don't think that's worth necessarily focusing on, because we don't even need that in order to justify it. What I do think is worth reading is the efficacy of prayers for the dead. So let's go to 12, if you have a Apocrypha with you, or if you have the book with you, 12:39 through 45. I'll go on 38 Sabbath there. Then, as he has now become necessary, Judas and his men went to take up the bodies of the fallen and bring them back to lie with their kindred in the sepulchres of the ancestors. Then under the tunic of each one of the dead, they found sacred scrolls of the idols of Gemnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. And it became clear that to all that this was the reason these men had fallen. So there's your punishment part. They were serving other gods, and so they got taken out. So they all blessed the ways of the Lord and the righteous judge who reveals these things that are hidden, and they turned to supplication, praying that the sin that had been committed might be wholly blotted out. So they're praying for the sins of the dead. They had died, they had committed sins. The noble Judas exhorted the people to keep themselves free from sin, for they had seen with their own eyes what had happened as a result of the sin for those who had fallen. They took up a collection. Okay, so here we go, seeding the idea of indulgences, man by man, to the account of 2,000 drachma of silver, and sent it to Jerusalem to provide for a sin offering for the dead. So those in purgatory, Jim's like, yeah, this is right. Yeah. I can see that smug face even with the crappy video transfer. Yeah. In doing this, he acted very well and honestly, taking into account all the account of the resurrection, again, promoting resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who had fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who had for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore, he made the atonement for the dead, that they might be delivered from their sin. Well, there you go. Doctrines of purgatory, doctrines of praying for the dead, practices of collecting money for the dead. That's like a massive piece in Catholic theology. That because, and again, this is not that we rejected this because we had a problem with it, but when you reject the book because it wasn't in the Jewish canon, then this becomes not canonical and just looked at as a practice of the folks at the time, of the culture of the time, that may or may not have been expressed. But if you don't look at it as God inspired this and we're supposed to have this for our instruction and our practice, whereas for Roman Catholics, if this was always considered part of the canon because they use the Septuagint, well, then it makes sense. We'd be like, well, there you go. We should pray for the dead. We should make a collection for the dead. We should make a sin offering for the dead. So you can say your Hail Marys, you can sell indulgences, you can all do all of these things in honor of those who died in sin and who are being purged from that sin. And we talked about purgatory and some of the other books that have come through. Interesting, huh? Yeah. Second verse, and there was another one, just aside, ex nihilo creation was in 7:28, but I don't think that, but we have other places in scripture where we sanction that as well. So now let's go to 15. 12 through 16. And this is concerning, this is the concern by the dead for the living, which is why Roman Catholics justify interceding to the saints. And one of the Catholic theologians I was listening to said, essentially, the Catholic theology is that when you die, you're not dead. You're not in soul sleep. Most Protestantism believes in some form of, realistically believes in some form of soul sleep, that when you die, well, I should say Reformed theology and much of the Protestant world says when you die, there's a momentary pause in one's consciousness, and then that is reactivated at the time of judgment and resurrection. Roman Catholics and some Protestants would say that when you die, either you go straight to heaven, which is not a doctrine that is highly supported, but that when you die, you go into a period of preparation to enter heaven, in particular those who have died with sin in their lives. But what we have here in 1526 is this. What he saw was this. Onias, again, the priest that we talked about earlier, who had been the high priest, a noble and good man of modest bearing and gentle manner, who spoke fittingly, had been trained from childhood in all that belongs to excellence, and was praying with outstretched hands for the whole body of the Jews. Then in the same fashion, another appeared, distinguished by his gray hair and dignity, and of the marble majesty and authority. And Onias spoke, saying, "This is a man who loved the family of Israel and prays much for the people and the holy city, Jeremiah, the prophet of God." So Jeremiah is returning. Jeremiah stretched out his hand and gave to Judas a golden sword. And as he gave it to him, he addressed him thus: "Take this holy sword, a gift from God, with which you will take to strike down your adversaries." And first of all, you're just going to pause and think to yourselves, well, if you're reading that, you're thinking by force we are to take things, golden sword. I mean, and interestingly enough, that's what Constantine saw, a sword and a vision of that. So maybe he was reading some of this as well. Where is it? Encouraged by the words of Judas, so noble and effective in arousing valor and awakening courage of the souls of the young, they determined not to carry on the campaign. That's that what I was looking at. 15. Did I write that down wrong? Oh, since the deceased prophet Jeremiah is portrayed as Judas' vision as praying on behalf of the Jewish people. And the idea is that Jeremiah is among the dead. And Jeremiah resurfaces, and by connecting to the dead, you're praying for the current church as alive. So praying to the dead for the living. And that idea is that again, the different levels of Catholic theology around hell is you have hell, or where you're in trouble. You have purgatory, where you're being prepared, and you have paradise, where the saints of the past dwell. But the idea is that the saints of the past are living. They're not dead. They're active. They're celestial beings now that have capacity. And so there is some sense of praying for the dead in that, interceding for in the intercession of the saints on behalf. If Jeremiah is praying for the people of Israel, then there are saints previously praying for. And that's not the only passage that lends themselves to that. Being mindful of the fact that there's 2 minutes till the end of it. Maccabees 3 is not concerned at all with the Maccabean revolt. It predated the revolt by 150 years. It covers the Egyptian king Ptolemy IV's elimination of the Jews. It's mostly considered legend, and also gives rise to the origin of Purim. It's called Maccabees. It's thought to have been called Maccabees in part because it provides background to the Maccabean revolt, but it was also in the Septuagint, was located next to Maccabees 1 and 2. So they were just like, it kind of fits the same genre, the same history. Let's just slap on a 3 or 4. It was originally written in Greek, composed in Egypt, and it was probably written between 215 and 70, with a strong emphasis by scholars that it was written in 100. Again, the time Maccabees 1 was written. So providing some background. And it really is looked at as an assembly of traditional stories. The Orthodox view it as deuterocanonical. Roman Catholics don't accept it as a part of the canon. Jews don't accept it as part of the canon, and we view it as the Apocrypha. And the last thing I would say, in terms of I just didn't read anything other than one commentary in the introduction in my Bible to it. But I will go ahead and I marked, because I do think it actually sheds a little light on what it is, just for the sake of knowledge. But again, I think the vast majority of the storyline really comes from Maccabees 1 and 2. And if I were to put it, I would say the history comes from Maccabees 1, the theology comes from Maccabees 2. But introduction, my Bible said, the author is a Hellenistic Jew, and his Greek influence is clear. He writes in Greek using Greek rhetorical techniques, and is familiar with Stoic and Platonic ideas. And that's what we talked about earlier, the idea of forms, the idea of the dualism between the heaven and the earth. And above all, centers on his thesis around basic Greek philosophical concept of reason, showing the strong Hellenization that happens. It is clear that he's a Jew, and his basic subject matter is Jewish. He champions the Jewish martyrs as heroes over against the tyrant Antiochus. and he alludes freely to the Old Testament. And above all, he redefines reason in terms of the law of Moses. So somewhat combating that Greek notion of reason with the wisdom of God found in the law of Moses, or adherence to the law of Moses. The attribution of the book to the first century Jewish historian Josephus by early church fathers Eusebius and Jerome is universally rejected, and the author's identity is unknown. So that's what I would say about that. So, which isn't much because I just read it, so I'm not taking any credit. That's what it was. So if I were to summarize all of it, I would say that Maccabees is a precursor, or provides background for us as Christians to understand what happened 200 years prior to the time of Christ, and why it was important to have Jewish identity. Sets up the stage quite nicely for Judas and the 330 shekels and the resistance to Christ's upside down kingdom. And because of the fact that it was left to us, or left to the early church, mostly in the Septuagint and Greek version, that for the first 1500 years, it did shape our theology and our understanding of prayers for the dead, of the idea of purgatory, and of collecting offerings and somehow influencing the lives of the dead, and also praying to those who have gone before us, which is the undergirding seeding of the idea of praying to the Virgin Mary, because again, she's someone who also is among the saints in heaven, or in paradise. I don't know where Catholics believe she is, but that all of these saints that have gone before us, not the ones that are in purgatory, but the ones who have attained that level of sanctification and are existing in this holy bliss, state of holy bliss until the judgment day, that they, not that, and honestly, I don't know, maybe they do have influence, maybe they have control, maybe they have power over celestial beings. But the fact is the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant and the Orthodox Church have doctrines around praying to the saints. Not that the icons or the pictures that we see of those saints are the actual exemplification. It's just meant to be, in some ways, looked as a porthole or a reminder of those saints who've gone before us. And that's all I got for Maccabees.
That's a lot.
So I know once I get started, sometimes it's just sort of,
No, the history of the world is complex. It becomes more to hear about it.
But it's interesting to know that all of this sort of happened.
But it also ties a lot of loose ends together.
It does,
because you don't always get that in study of history, of that thread that goes through with all the little variables and how this affects this and this and this.
And I would say one of the biggest travesties I see in all this is, as Protestants, we don't have this history. I mean, most Protestantism, I guarantee you, doesn't know what the Maccabean revolt is, and doesn't know how it influenced the time of Christ. And shouldn't we understand that in order to understand why Christ, what the context that Christ was facing in general Judea, or the house of Israel, but also within the Sadducees and the Pharisees and those in control of power at the time. And not to mention just the influence when you think about the fact that you had the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and then the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans, and all of these coming in. They're constantly in occupation. They're constantly under the threat of some other culture, constantly battling to define who they are. And it's a reestablishment. And you could say maybe even in a weirder sense now, Palestinian influence, American Western influence over Jews. I mean, this is one of the biggest things about Jews today. They say they've lost their Jewishness because they've sold their soul to Hollywood. I mean, Jews run Hollywood. There's no debate of that. There were more Jews in Hollywood, and for only being 1% of the world religion, they have quite a powerful influence over world thought. So, all right, that's it.
Thank you.
Next week, Jim is going to be gone, and because it's Ash Wednesday,
Mm-hmm.